Is the Latin News podcast, our first episode of 2024. This week we'll be talking about Argentina and President Milei. We have none other than Jon Farmer, editor-in-chief of LatinNews, here on the line from London. And we're going to discuss everything Argentina related because, well, it makes for a great story, and perhaps we can go a little bit further, a little bit more profoundly into, well, who is Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, and of course, where he stands and what he's doing. So welcome back here on the Latin News podcast, Jon.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Richard.
Well, no, I mean, you work on this day in, day out, and no one better, I think, to talk about Milei, a larger-than-life character. We know him from all of the pictures in the newspapers, wielding his chainsaw, his, I would say, curious haircut, of course, makes the headlines as well. You have plenty of stories about him, but let's start from the very beginning. Where did this guy appear from?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, he does have this various eccentricities, which myriad media reports have focused on. You know, the idea that he practices telepathy with his living and dead dogs to get political advice. That he was a tantric sex instructor. He made his name as a sort of daytime TV personality. As you mentioned, his hairstylist sort of described him as Wolverine, so sort of unstable but with a heart of gold. He calls himself an anarcho-capitalist. He's a sort of free market libertarian, so he's in favor of legalizing the sale of human organs or transplants. And then during the campaign, he was obviously called for dollarization and blowing up the central bank. So yes, he's a colorful character, shall we say. But yeah, where he came from. So, I mean, comparisons are often made between Milei and Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro. So, I mean, obviously, from a point of view of ideological point of view, there's an affinity, right, on the both far right. But Bolsonaro, yes, very much a maverick, like Milei, but he'd been in Congress for nearly 3 decades. Bolsonaro, people often forget that. So Milei, politically speaking, was much more of a genuine outsider. This was a guy who did pretty much come out of nowhere. He'd served as a deputy in the lower chamber of Congress for 2 years. So that's the sort of sum total of his political experience, if you like. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, suddenly we have him.
But he
with
touched a nerve, didn't he? He touched a nerve getting out there and obviously representing everything opposite, everything in opposition to sort of Peronist history and Kirchnerism and everything that has been going on in Argentina. Can we say he was a protest vote, or people genuinely back his policies? They want to see the central bank blown up.
Very good question. So people were drawn to him. You know, he's popular. He's an anti-system candidate. The system's seen as corrupt and totally ineffective. And you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it keeps breaking, you need a different fix, right? So I think he tapped into that voter sentiment. Populism is seductive, as we know. He's a very charismatic speaker, as you alluded to early on. You know, that wielding a chainsaw over his head during the campaign. I mean, I think many people warm to that sort of theatricality, but above all, as you pointed out, he wasn't one of them. So he's not one of the same old politicians dogged by corruption who'd mismanaged the economy so badly. Also, I think we need to bear in mind the guy he was running against for the Peronists was the economy minister, Sergio Massa. So this always looked risky. Many voters saw him as the sort of face of failure with inflation skyrocketing. But, you know, it wasn't, and to allude to the final part of your question, I mean, I think it wasn't because voters have hard right views, or they're suddenly converted to the idea of free market economics, or they share some of Milei's anti-abortion views or his attacks on the Pope, which, an Argentine, lest we forget, or you know, that they're like sort of turkeys voting for Christmas. They fancy some really savage spending cuts and an end to subsidies. No, I mean, I think he was elected in large part, I would argue, despite all of this, not because of this. And this is a point. This is a massive indictment of the political class, or the political caste, as he repeatedly calls them, at every opportunity. We've just been unequal to the task of governing Argentina for so long. And I mean, I think there was an element of this is a leap into the unknown, but let's face it, the known hasn't exactly been a resounding success, right? This is, so how much worse can it be? And do people believe Milei can turn it around? Ardent supporters probably yes, but others probably not. They're thinking, let's just stick it to the established political class. And so when I say there's a strong element of that in it, there was, of course, but you know, he won only 30% in the first round of elections. So it was really what happened next, I think, was crucial, because Patricia Bullrich, the presidential candidate for Juntos por el Cambio, which is the sort of traditional right of center coalition of parties, she endorsed his candidacy after she was eliminated after the first round. So this was a woman who Milei had denigrated during the campaign as a Montonera terrorist and murderer from, you know, the dictatorship days, and part of the political caste which he professed to revile. And suddenly they're sort of embracing, and this, I think, and then he goes on to appoint her, of course, as his security minister. But I think this made him look more reasonable. You know, he put the chainsaw in the shed for the second round campaign. And for supporters of Bullrich, who were perhaps wary of Milei, this was a sort of important signal. This, you know, here's a guy who's okay. We can work with him. He's a bit rough around the edges, but we can shape him. And crucially, and this is the point that Bullrich kept making, crucially, we can get rid of Kirchner recently.
You sort of ask yourself, is who would want the presidency in Argentina? I mean, it's a poison chalice. This we see the cycles of boom and bust. The economy is just, I mean, we've looked at it. I go all the way back to De La Rua and you know, the burning of the tires. Yeah, I was there during that period, and
oh, really?
It was quite exciting for me as cutting my teeth as a journalist. But you sort of look back and you go through it all, and you're like, okay, Milei is kind of promising an economic miracle. I have to ask you, how does he plan to do so in a country which really has never been able to get its coffers in shape?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, successive governments have lurched between sort of sharp austerity and irresponsible spending, being debt and currency crises, significant official corruption, though. I mean, that's been a theme sort of throughout. Then this guy comes along, he's promising to restore Argentina to its illustrious past of a century ago, you know, when it's one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world per capita. But and then he claims that this is all within reach. We just get the economic house in order. In numerous interviews, he talks about Argentina's GDP per capita eclipsing the US in 35 years. So, yeah, how does he pull off this miracle? Well, his answer is shock therapy, fiscal adjustment and austerity. I mean, there's nothing particularly new there. Carlos Menem, who's a sort of neoliberal idol of Milei's from the 90s, whose nephew, incidentally, Milei, is made president of the lower chamber of Congress. He also used shock therapy to try and bring down rampant inflation. So what's Milei proposing exactly? Well, I mean, he didn't waste much time. So he's appointed Luis Caputo, who was the finance minister of Mauricio Macri, the president from 2015 to 2019, as his economy minister. And Caputo, like a few days after he'd come in, so he released this sort of recorded message, and he said, "Look, we've always been addicted to deficit in this country, and that's got to stop. You know, spending more than we have has to stop." But the thing is, he's not really talking about sort of weaning Argentines off spending it, which is what Macri tried, right? A gradual approach. He's pretty much talking about going cold turkey. And, this is inflation. He said inflation's going to get much higher. He was quite plain about that. He said, people need to be accustomed to an uncomfortable truth that's better than a comforting lie. And in July, inflation has got significantly higher already. I mean, just last Friday, so that's the 12th of January, INDEC, so that's the National Statistics Institute in Argentina, released inflation figures for 2023, which showed that inflation was 211%, and monthly inflation in December was 25.5%. So that annual figure actually steals Venezuela's crown in the region, which is a pretty dubious accolade. It wouldn't quite have eclipsed Venezuela, which I think off the top of my head was 193%. If Caputo hadn't announced one of his first measures, this massive devaluation of the currency. So there's a 54% devaluation within days of coming in. And Argentina had this very artificially high official exchange rate. This went to 800 pesos to the dollar subsequently. So this got closer, although not all the way, but closer to the so-called blue dollar. This is a sort of black market rate, which is around 1,100 pesos to the dollar. But Caputo, he said that you need to be swinging spending cuts, but this would start from government. So government would set the example here. There'd be massive cuts in public expenditures. The number of cabinet ministries who reduced in half, from 18 to 9. The number of secretaries of state, so that's sort of one rung below ministry level, sort of deputy ministry, that's also been cut from about 100 to around 50. Public works projects cancelled if they've not started, and no more will be put out to tender. Transport and utility subsidies will be reduced and then phased out within 2 years. I mean, these are really onerous for the Treasury in Argentina, have really sort of deepened the fiscal deficit. But getting rid of them will seriously push up the cost of electricity and gas and spur inflation further. It kind of reminds me, actually, just talking about that, reminds me of, I write about Uruguay quite a bit, and Uruguay's former president, Jose Mujica, he used to describe inflation as a slippery eel because it was so difficult to get a grip on. But Argentina, and it's an altogether more serious sea monster than sort of in Uruguay, if you like, and it would be very, very difficult to get a grip on.
It's always the economy. I mean, and this stripping back everything to the bare bones, as you say, halving the cabinet, halving sort of ministry, and so on. The promise to dollarize the economy. Where do we see that progressing?
Dollarization.
Yeah.
Well, people don't really want pesos. There's a reason why so many Argentines have savings abroad. They don't trust it. They don't trust Argentine banks and institutions, so they seek refuge in the dollar. It's a kind of anchor in these frequent financial storms in Argentina. And the 2001-2002 financial meltdown, when lots of people lost their savings overnight, it takes a heck of a lot to rebuild confidence after experiences like that. Would dollarization solve this issue? Well, it has problems of its own, and just getting it off the ground would be so challenging. You can't dollarize without dollars, right? And even by his own admission, it would need sort of $40 billion. Where are they going to come from? I mean, Argentina's up to its ears in dollar-denominated debt. The central bank doesn't have enough dollars to cover the pesos currently in circulation. Dollarization, it's not a panacea. It could absolutely lower inflation, but you've not got sort of control over monetary policy. Overspending still possible. Argentina would have to run a current account surplus. The other issue, of course, is that strong dollar would make Argentina's exports more expensive and less competitive. I mean, we know just how important agricultural exports are to the economy, for instance. I mean, Argentina's international reserves were absolutely pummeled last year because of a severe drought, which reduced agricultural exports so much, and foreign exchange, wasn't flooding in.
This is a good part for me to jump in. Then is, you've gone through major international themes here. How have investors, how have investors in Argentina, foreign investors, seen this movement by Milei and the presidency of Milei?
I think investors are likely to feel sort of mixed emotions, really. They've reacted with as they're encouraged by it. Local businesses are sort of encouraged by it. I think Milei wants to incentivize foreign investment in, the hydrocarbons industry, lithium, renewable energy. He wants to rip up red tape and bureaucracy. I mean, he thinks climate change is sort of socialist flim-flam. So he wants to reduce constraints on investment. So on the one hand, I think, yes, this makes Argentina an attractive proposition for investors. But, on the other hand, there's a serious risk of social unrest, which investors don't want to, as we know, and political uncertainty that goes with that, obviously. And then, of course, threatening to pull Argentina out of Mercosur and the massive problems that this would create with Brazil, which is what he said he'd do during the campaign. I mean, I know he's not going to deliver on that threat. Now he's in office and he's acting in a more pragmatic way, but it did mark him out as a loose cannon. And I think, investors will be sort of wary of that, whilst they're encouraged by some of the moves he's made, for sure. There will also be a degree of caution, I think.
I think so. This is, and the IMF in general, when we look at that, how are they responding?
Yeah, the IMF's, that's an interesting one, because I mean, a visiting team from the IMF was just in Argentina just last week, offered very firm support for Milei's proposed changes and his reforms. So, and it agreed to disperse a $3.3 billion loan to Argentina. This has been held up since last November, and another 1.4 billion sort of ahead of schedule. So this allowed the government to meet impending payments to the IMF, which I think were about 2.6 billion, if I remember. And the IMF, praised Milei, praised his team for moving quickly and decisively with a strong policy package and so on. And this, I think, the key part of the statement that I took was after the previous government had gone severely off track. So, and the targets weren't being met. But it did say, look, the path forward will be a challenging one, and very much like Milei, to be honest. I mean, very much echoing Milei's words during his inauguration. Of all the speeches I've heard at inauguration ceremonies, his was about as downbeat as I can recollect. I mean, he was absolutely, he wasn't sugarcoating anything. And the IMF sort of reiterated that, things are going to get worse before they get better. And Milei has said, that his austerity measures go way beyond anything that the IMF has advocated. And I'm sure the IMF would rather that than that a government, consistently fails to meet targets. But at the same time, the IMF, just like investors, it doesn't want an explosion of social unrest in Argentina either, and the serious political repercussions that would come from that.
We'll get into social unrest in a minute, because there are points there that I'd like to cover. But you mentioned, of course, Milei talking in his campaign about withdrawing Argentina from Mercosur. This is obviously foreign policy. This is local foreign policy within the region. But where does he stand then? What it really, as a president taking Argentina forwards, is he likely to move towards China, the US, Brazil? I mean, I get the idea that he wants to position Argentina once again as sort of a leading nation from the sort of the Hispanic section of South America, right? Like a spokesperson for the region. How do you feel about this?
I think he's been very clear actually about his foreign policy priorities. So geopolitically, he wants to bring Argentina firmly back into the orbit of the US. And I mean, he's been very candid about that. So a restoration of reminds me of sort of Carlos Menem during his government. There was the talk of having carnal relations with Washington, and that's kind of what that defined ties under Menem. And I think Milei would like to sort of restore that. He doesn't want to be aligned with what he called communists in his campaign, and of course he included in that definition communist President Lula da Silva, who's president of neighboring Brazil, and he said at the time in the campaign that he wouldn't have any dealings with Brazil and he'd withdraw Argentina from Mercosur, and he wanted to cut ties with China. I mean, these are Argentina's two largest trading partners, so this would be economic suicide. Of course, this is the campaign. He's now in government. Things do change, although I'm sure they won't be forgotten. But after his victory, he did send so his future foreign minister, Diana Mondino, he sent her to Brasilia to sort of try and smooth things over. Actually, he did extend an invitation to Lula to his inauguration. Lula didn't come, of course. Bolsonaro was in attendance for starters, so I don't think he would have been keen to sort of bump into him, and I don't think he'd forgotten a lot of the very offensive comments that Milei made during the campaign. So I think it's fair to say relations, I don't think will be close, but I think equally pragmatism will prevail. Argentina needs Brazil more than vice versa. And ties actually probably will be a bit better than they were when Bolsonaro was in power and Alberto Fernandez was in power in Argentina, because that was also a shocking relationship from a rapport perspective. And Milei did actually keep Daniel Scioli, the ambassador to Brazil. He kept him in place from Fernandez's administration into his, to Fernandez's disgust. He was like, how could this guy serve under me and then serve under Milei? It's just inconceivable. But the China thing that you mentioned, I think that's very interesting. So again, I envisage colder relations there. I think it will be very much focused on sort of commercial matters. But significantly, China has sort of suspended its swap line to Argentina's central bank within a couple of weeks of Milei taking office. So this is cutting off access to sort of cheap funding, which has been in place since 2009. So I think that's really kind of pressuring Milei to take a less stridently forthright sort of critical stance on China.
There's something very key that you said in this is, of course, what is said in the campaign and what is done, obviously, on the ground now that he's in power. And as the word pragmatism, and of course, you felt at the beginning that he was being rather moderate with some of his nominations. But I suppose as time ticks on, he'll surround himself with more, let's say, friendly politicians and yes men to be able to force through some of his plans. Because, I mean, in Congress, he's not, he hasn't got a majority. He's threatening to legislate by decree to push all these things. So you figure that he's going to be backed into a corner and will start lashing out.
That's entirely possible. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And in Congress, so his party, this sort of personalist party, La Libertad Avanza, will be the weakest of any president since the return to democracy in 1983. So his party's got just 38 deputies in the lower chamber. So that's got 257 seat lower chamber, 7 senators in the 72 seat Senate. So we're talking a long, long way of having a majority, his party. But, he could try and work with Congress, build a consensus. But his attitude, I think, has slightly alienated potential allies in Juntos por el Cambio. So this is the right of center traditional opposition that is kind of keen to work with him, but wants to ensure that he remains moderate. So we've got the two main parties in it are Propuesta Republicana. So that's the party of Bullrich, who was in the elections, lost in the first round, who's now his security minister. For the most part, the Pro, as they're called, they're inclined to back him, and they got 40 odd deputies. So again, not enough for a majority, but a lot more than he has. And then the other main party in Juntos is the Unión Cívica Radical, the UCR. So this was fiercely critical of Milei during the campaign as representing anti-democracy, and was actually incensed that Bullrich endorsed his candidacy, because it said, look, she doesn't speak for the whole coalition. She did, but they weren't happy about that. Now, the UCR has rode back on that a bit. It's now prepared to work with the government. But there's no way it's going to give him carte blanche. There's massive disquiet about his requests for superpowers in particular. So, there's this omnibus bill that's been sent, that Milei has sent to Congress, which contains some 564 articles. And one of those is seeking legislative powers to basically rule by decree in a whole range of areas in response to what Milei describes as the current national emergency, and that this would be in place for 2 years, with the option to extend for a further 2 years. So that would essentially cover his entire 4-year term. Now, obviously, Congress isn't really, even parties that might be inclined to support him aren't going to be ecstatic at the idea of essentially being denuded of power in a lot of areas for such a very long period of time. So he hasn't shown any great appetite for negotiation. He's maintained that, in fact, he won't negotiate anything in that bill. I think that is just a sort of tough negotiating stance, ironically, and that he has said he's sort of, I can't, how did he put it? That he's prepared to take suggestions, I think is how he put it, so it's semantic. I think there's a sort of slight game of semantics there. So I think he probably will ultimately need to negotiate in order to get that through. And it may be that elements of it will just have to be reformed. So perhaps Congress might be prepared, for instance, to grant him some legislative powers to rule by decree, but for a much shorter period of time and in much more defined areas.
That I can understand. This, and I can understand very much so an opposition to this ruling by decree, and for such a long period of time that can be extended. And that alarm bells ring. That's it, when you hear that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And that's really where you sort of jump in at the idea of the reality of social unrest. There have already been demonstrations in Argentina, and I know that on the 24th of January there is a general strike. The unions are all in opposition. This social unrest, and I do know that aren't they looking to not outlaw protests, but certainly make protests far more difficult in Argentina right now?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. There's a general strike planned for 24th of January, which has been called by the CGT, which is the largest and most powerful trade union movement in Argentina. And this was after he sent this omnibus bill to Congress, the one, asking for congressional powers to rule by decree. And this, to my knowledge, is the earliest sort of call for industrial action in a presidential term I can think of. So it's just 6 weeks into his term. the trade union movement's very powerful in Argentina. There's, as you alluded to there, there's also the piquetero social movements who were empowered under Kirchnerismo, who have already flexed their muscles on the 28th of December with protests in Buenos Aires province. And then, of course, what is the overall risk of further social unrest? Well, I mean, you've got to say it's very significant. I mean, Caputo did promise to double payments under social welfare programs like universal child allowance and the food card scheme. And he said he'd cut out intermediaries and end the sort of political clientelism which was rife under Kirchnerista governments. So the payments would go directly to those who sort of most need it. But let's face it, if the removal of price controls, food inflation soared even higher than inflation in December. Removing energy and transport subsidies, this is going to hurt. This is going to be painful. There's a quote I'm reminded of when I say that. Argentina's presidential spokesperson, Manuel Adorni, so he acknowledged there was going to be significant pain, saying there was no option. And he said, how did he put it? That, we didn't receive a patient with a toothache. That's right. We didn't receive a patient with toothache. We found one in intensive care that's about to die. So, that drastic measures were going to be absolutely essential. There was no alternative to this. Coming back to the other part of your sort of question, though, Milei's not naive. He will have anticipated there are likely to be social protests. So Bullrich has drawn up this what she calls a protocol of public order, or an anti-piquete plan to try and clamp down on protests. So there'll be very serious penalties for roadblocks. They'd essentially be outlawed in protests. So you'd only be able to protest on pavements, which will be hugely challenging if you've got large numbers of protesters to sort of stick to that. But these penalties wouldn't just apply to those taking part in the protest. These would also apply to those transporting, organizing, and financing the protests. So, this is a significant preparation for what I imagine he envisages is likely to lie ahead.
You see, they've laid this groundwork in all of this rhetoric. As you say, the patient dying in intensive care, that things are going to get harder, that inflation's going to obviously worsen immensely before it gets better. So they've laid this groundwork for, I would say, unrest. They know it's going to happen. I think I would suggest all of this movement is like, you know what's going to happen. So, I mean, this is Argentina at the end, and my final kind of comment here is, and don't obviously bet your professional career on this, Jon, but do we think that Milei will see out his term? Do we think we'll see him being forced or to step aside, or stepping aside voluntarily before his term is up?
You're right. I mean, this is the classic question where you can get made to look a fool a few months down the line, right? I mean, I think there's a few sort of key points. I'll back into this one. I mean, I think, look, Milei's not renowned for his emotional stability. He's got minimal political experience, but as we've discussed earlier, I do think he's been quite politically adroit in some areas in terms of his cabinet appointments and stuff, and than he's been given credit for. He's moderated his stance, but he definitely has an underlying authoritarian streak, and if Congress sort of stymies his agenda, will he sort of revert to this radical, belligerent figure of the election campaign? Well, quite possibly. I mean, by the standards of his campaign rhetoric, yes, he is being moderate so far, but I don't expect this to last if he feels sort of frustrated or thwarted by Congress. And I think he'll keep pushing Congress. He'll keep blaming Congress for failing to support his reforms if things go wrong. he's not afraid to resort to repression if there is social unrest. But there's a lot that's wrong with Argentina. Right? Voters wouldn't be electing someone like Javier Milei if that weren't the case. But will he see out his term? Not many non-Peronists have. Let's face it. If he can turn the economy around and reduce inflation, these are two huge ifs. A lot will hinge, I think, on how he pulls through the next few months, when, by his own admission, things will be getting a lot worse, and whether we see some more sort of green shoots after that, because there will be a limit to how much pain sort of people can absorb before they're expecting it. And I think there's a degree of acceptance of that, but obviously when the reality bites, that might sort of change. But have I ducked the question?
That's okay. That's okay. You're not betting your professional reputation on this, but there's as you said, huge ifs, huge questions, and how much pain are Argentines prepared to, absorb if they're not going to see any return on that as well. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting from this. So again, like I said, I'm glad you didn't gamble your professional reputation there, because you are Jon Farmer, the editor-in-chief of LatinNews. So you've got to be careful on these things. You don't want to look like a fool down the line. Off mic, we could probably discuss what you really think. But let's keep this on mic. And take this moment to say thank you so much for your time, and of course quite exhaustive knowledge on Argentina and what's going on right now. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks so much, Richard.
It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to Jon Farmer here, editor-in-chief of LatinNews. They're in London. I am Richard McCall, the host of this podcast here in Bogota, Colombia. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time discussing more issues and topics from around the region. But this has been the first episode of 2024, discussing Argentina and President Milei, and of course his proposed economic miracle in that country. So stay tuned for more. Thank you for listening, and of course, goodbye.